dot 2:40 to get back to the House of Lords, so we will be slightly constrained for questions, but we'll try and fit in as many as we can. Julia, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'm delighted to be with you, and I slightly worried when I realised, A, Ian was having trouble getting anybody to be quiet because you were all having a great time and enjoying lunch, and B, I've been given the graveyard slot. But there you go. Well, I suppose it's about right, because to some extent all I can do is raise questions rather than give you any of our conclusions. And the reason for that is that I'm chairing a subcommittee of the Science and Technology Select Committee of the House of Lords, which was set up to explore behaviour change thinking in government policy. And we are going to publish a report in the next few weeks, but we haven't quite finished it yet, so I can't tell you what it's going to say. And I'm very sorry about that, because I think it's going to be quite interesting. So I will be throwing out some broad themes, and as I can see, you're all very keen on talking to each other. So I hope that the questions will end up with a sort of debate between you, and we might even find some of that quite useful. Anyway, just so that you know where I'm coming from, the Science and Technology Committee has a very broad remit to scrutinise any government policy from a science and technology perspective. And quite a lot of the members, incidentally, of the Science and Technology Committee are not scientists. I'm not a scientist myself at all. And what it can include is looking at policy areas which ought to be informed by scientific research, and we can look at technological challenges and science policy itself. But why that's important is that there's quite large areas of government policy where you would say it ought to be informed by the latest current scientific research, and it isn't always so. And governments, governments have a habit of getting bees in their bonnets and going with hunches. And, the thing about government is they get bright ideas, and they have very, very young policy advisors. I'm 61. I think they're very, very young. They're a lot younger than my children. This is ridiculous. What do they think they actually know? Anyway, I didn't really say that. But it is really important that, what governments do, and they all do, any group, and I'm a Lib Dem here, so I'm part of the coalition. I'm going to the crossbenchers in the autumn. But you just so you, and that's not for political reasons, I'm becoming a full-time rabbi again, so I can't have a political link. So, but the thing that's really important is, here are governments with their ideas. How informed are they by research that is in the public domain? How serious are governments about analysing what they're doing and about evaluating the results of what they've done to inform the next stage of whatever it is that they want to do? And I think that's a key question. I think that's a brilliant question that the Science and Technology Committee keeps asking, and it's one of the reasons I so love the work of the committee. Now, this particular committee, the Subcommittee on Behaviour Change, was set up in the summer of last year, and it's going to publish its report, as I said, in about a month. And because it hasn't been published, I can't share the conclusions, but I can tell you why we began the inquiry, and I can tell you about some of the biggest problems we discovered just as we've been going on with it. Now, what we wanted to do is to try and discover the scientific evidence behind all the behaviour change work that government undertakes, and then to look at whether or not government uses the evidence when it's formulating its policies, which are designed to change all of our behaviour. Now, this conference is obviously focused on living sustainably, but of course encouraging more sustainable behaviour in daily living is just one very small part of the huge range of all kinds of behaviour that governments want to change. This government and any other government for that matter. For example, you could list public health issues, reducing crime, dealing with unemployment, growing the economy, and all of those involve changing the behaviour of the population in order for the government to be successful in what it sets out to do. So I think what you have to say, and certainly we began to say, we started on this work, that the stuff on the scientific evidence around behaviour change ought to be a core of most policy making, because changing the public's behaviour is a very large part of what governments want to do. And I think that's what governments are about. So when we began the inquiry, we were particularly concerned about nudge and nudging. Coalition government particularly seems to embrace the idea of nudging, albeit within a much more general sort of pattern of thought around avoiding the use of regulation to change behaviour and seeing whether you can nudge or do other things, change defaults, in order to get people to change behaviour. And Andrew Lansley, Secretary of State for Health, everybody will know, but told the House of Commons when he launched the Public Health White Paper last year that the government would be nudging and not nannying people to live more healthily. And so we were particularly interested to see what the sciences have to say about nudging. But as it turned out, and this bit I can tell you, we found it extremely difficult to distinguish between evidence on nudging and evidence on all the other ways in which behaviour can be changed. And as part of the inquiry, we explored 2 case studies in much greater depth. First, we looked at changing behaviour to reduce obesity, and then we looked at changing behaviour to reduce crimes. And before I start telling you about what we actually found, problems particularly we found, I should perhaps say that the behaviour change inquiry has obviously touched a public nerve, and I think people are really interested in this. And we received a huge amount of evidence, and there was one point where Daisy Ricketts, clerk to the inquiry, who's sitting in the front row there, where she sent out sort of stuff for us to read, and there was a pack, it was about this thick. And actually, you really couldn't carry it around. It was just too heavy. I mean, it's been enormous, the amount of evidence we received. By the end, well over 150 pieces of written evidence, and we heard from over 70 individuals in person. And our witnesses were very diverse. So, of course, we had to hear from government, we do, from cabinet ministers, civil servants, representatives of local authorities. We also heard from academics and researchers, and Resolve was involved in that, got written evidence, and then we saw Tim Jackson separately, and we heard from people with a very broad range of expertise, and we heard from NGOs and from charities, and we heard from businesses, from advertising companies to Stagecoach and Sainsbury's. And we had to think very carefully about what the most important messages are for government, because there was such a huge quantity of evidence that we received, and sifting it and finding out what the key bits were was really quite a major task. So here are some problems that we discovered during the course of the inquiry, which are really relevant, I think, to the thinking you're doing. Well, first of all, key ethical question. Is it acceptable for governments to try and change our behaviour? And if it's acceptable, how is it acceptable? In what ways? Now, that's the ethical issue. The inquiry has shown, has flagged up, that the idea that governments might want to change our behaviour, or are actually changing our behaviour, sometimes makes some people rather nervous. It makes people think about subliminal messaging, or other ways, hidden ways, in which government might want to make us do what we necessarily want to do, but what they want us to do, without us realising it. And almost everybody regards that kind of subliminal messaging as unethical. And it threw up a huge range of questions. I'm not going to answer them, I don't think I could actually, but they're important for everyone who wants to think and talk about changing behaviour. And I think there is a small p political question, which is true for any government. Clearly governments want to change our behaviour, and actually it's very often right that they should want to do so. But the question really is, to what extent we vote for governments, to what extent should we then give in some way our active consent to the ways in which they want to change our behaviour? How do you deal with that? And you can give some examples, and I'll come on to this in a moment, but give some examples, say, parts of Scandinavia, where they decided that, drunkenness was just too big a social problem. The public was not asked about the considerable raising of the price of alcohol. I mean, in Sweden, for many, many years, alcohol was just, beyond what most normal people could afford. And the result, and as I discovered going to a dinner in Sweden and discovering you've got lots and lots of toast and you only get one glass, really difficult. But if you haven't told you in advance, it's really difficult. But very interesting, because if the public hasn't consented, they will find ways around it. Because people are actually quite good at finding ways around things they don't actually want to accept. So there's a real question about us electing governments in the full knowledge that the government is going to want to change our behaviour in ways that are good for us and probably good for the population as a whole, and to what extent we have to consent to that. And I think that's a really, really major issue. So first, is a behaviour change intervention acceptable if it restricts our choice? Well, the government told us in terms that they wanted to protect freedom of choice, and most people would, I think, argue that it's a pretty good thing to want to protect. But lots of our evidence suggested that often the more restrictive measures, regulation, significant fiscal measures, are more effective in changing behaviours. So alcohol pricing, that's why I use the Scandinavian example, is quite a good example of this. The NICE guidance on preventing harmful drinking, which was published last year, showed that at the price level proposed by the government, which was the rate of duty plus VAT, a reduction of consumption of between 0.1% and 0.4% could be expected. However, a minimum price per unit of 40p would reduce consumption by 2.4%, while minimum prices, if you go up the scale, of 50 pence or 60 pence per unit would reduce consumption by 6.7% and 11.9% respectively. Now, so do we all have to consent to a very considerable increase, and does that actually limit freedom of choice? I don't think, this is a debate that goes backwards and forwards, but if you want to change behaviour, it is one clear message here that one very effective way of doing it is to increase the price per unit of alcohol. And of course, there are lots of reasons why that might be less popular, including, of course, that poorer people who want to drink will find that much more, their freedom of choice much more than more wealthier people. But there are all sorts of business arguments and so on. So what should you do? Is there a point at which restriction of choice is less important than the effectiveness of an intervention? And if so, how do we decide where that is? And do we actually care about the restriction of choice for people who abuse alcohol? Well, I mean, that's quite, I don't know, I can't really tell the age of people in the audience, but some of you will have student-age children, and that's quite a large group who abuse alcohol. But even if we don't mind about caring about the restriction of choice for people who abuse alcohol, do we care about the restriction of choice for people who drink in moderation? And how do you deal with the fact that restricting the choice of a person who abuses alcohol so that they drink less might actually increase another person's choice by, for instance, reducing antisocial behaviour, and so make it easier for someone else to walk through particular areas at night? How do you titrate that? How do you set one against the other? Second, are behaviour change interventions that constrain businesses more acceptable than those that constrain individuals? Now, alcohol pricing is a very good example of an intervention which affects both businesses and individuals. Individuals can't buy very cheap alcohol, and businesses can't sell very cheap alcohol. But do we care as much about the constraint on businesses as we do about the constraint on individuals? We want to respect the freedom of choice of individuals, but do businesses, as corporates as it were, have freedom of choice in the same way? And is it acceptable for governments to influence behaviour if those who are being influenced do not realise, let alone agree to what's being done? Now, most people don't think it's okay for governments to use subliminal messaging to influence how individuals behave. But what's the difference between that, say, and the government introducing a nudge, like changing the default for organ donation, so the DVLA forms in future, you will have to opt out of organ donation rather than opting in, without telling us about it? Do we always want the government to tell us clearly and transparently what they're doing? And Dr. David Halpern, who's head of the Behavioural Insights team in the Cabinet Office, went so far as to suggest to us that the government ought to seek public permission for interventions which change behaviour. But what do you then say if that public permission limits the effect of an intervention, as might well be the case with some nudges, because if people know it's there, then they might change their pattern of behaviour, so they, if you like, get round the nudge. And on a practical point, how does the government go about seeking public permission on a regular basis? Second issue, which is a big issue, I think, for the academics here. How do we generate more long-term applied behavioural research? So the second problem is a real science problem. On the whole, what witnesses said to us was that the various sciences which contribute to understanding behaviour and behaviour change, psychology, sociology, behavioural economics to mention but three, provide a very sound theoretical base, and that lots of experimental research has been carried out to test the theories. But what many witnesses also said, not very convenient for us, was that there wasn't a great deal of evidence from applied behavioural research, in the sense of research that looks at how to change behaviour in real-world situations. And I know this isn't realistic to resolve. But this, of course, is the kind of applied research that's the sort of research most relevant to policymakers. before I go on, I should say that it was the area of reducing car use which provided the most information that we had made available to us about this sort of applied research. And Richard Bartholomew, who's the joint head of the Government Social Research Unit, said to us that there was a frustration on the part of policymakers that there's very good academic research, but the researchers often don't take the final step and answer the question, well, what would you do about it then? And I think it is worth, just as an aside, because I know that Resolve is coming to its end, and that's part of the reason for this conference, and it's reinventing itself, am I right, Ian, as the Sustainable Lifestyles Research Group. And one of the things I suppose I hope we would say to you guys is actually what we need you guys to do is to give us the, and what would you do about it then? And that's the bit that we got a lot of criticism actually of academia about. And I think it's actually more complicated than that. I'm married to an academic, so I would say this, wouldn't I? But I don't think universities are structured to think about research that, if you like, has that direct policy application on the whole. That's not what universities do. It's not how universities are judged to be good or bad. You know, it's not how the research assessment exercise works. So I think there's a mismatch between, if you like, how academia works and what policymakers need. And I think that there need to be some very devious academics in there thinking about how you actually bridge that gap. And it seems to me that that's a huge problem. And some years ago, I was chief executive of the King's Fund, and we did a lot of policy analysis. And it seems to me it's that policy analysis and then what you would do about it that's the bit that's missing from a lot of the academic research. So we've got a lot of stuff that's extremely useful, except you couldn't see how it would directly help policymakers. So witnesses made lots of suggestions as to why it might be the case, that there's very relatively little applied behavioural research. Some people mentioned funding, you won't be wholly surprised to hear. Others said that funding wasn't the issue, but it was the research capacity. Professor Dame Sally Davis, who's now the Chief Medical Officer, emphasised that point. She said that it just wasn't the research capacity. And other people said the point that I've just made, that researchers just don't have adequate incentives to conduct this sort of research because it doesn't help you get any further within a university. So the question then is, why is there not more applied behavioural research looking at how to change behaviours in the real world situations? And once an answer has been established to that, there is of course a question about what should be done about it, and that's equally difficult to answer. And I think there's a more complicated question, which again I hope is something that your new group will look at, which is how do you bring the academic and policy making communities closer together to look at this sort of question. It's a question to which the answer has been sought for decades, but it's really important if we're saying, I think we all are, that government policies ought to be evidence-based. Well, third, having said all that lot, how do you actually improve the evaluation of government policies? So I was just talking about getting more applied research into behaviour change, but one obvious way of doing something about that would be for government to evaluate their individual policy interventions better, so that they themselves become a form of applied research. And you could argue that government is actually the only location of the sort of resources that you need to undertake behaviour change research at the kind of a real population level. So I think there's a real question about that, and I'm hoping that that's one of the things we're going to tackle. However, there wasn't a witness who didn't agree that the evaluation of government initiatives at the moment leaves a great deal to be desired. And some of the ways that people said evaluation could be improved included building evaluation into policy design from the outset. That's really a no-brainer, but doesn't happen a lot of the time. Ensuring good outcome measures, again a no-brainer, doesn't happen a lot of the time. Collecting longitudinal data, quite expensive very often. Using controls wherever possible. Ensuring sufficient funding for evaluation. And establishing data on cost effectiveness. I'm not going to go through each of those, but two of the most controversial, using controls and collecting longitudinal data, are worth another couple of words. So our witnesses disagreed quite a lot about whether randomised controlled trials were the most rigorous form of evaluation for behaviour change interventions. And in particular, it was suggested that a multi-method evaluation, where you use a whole range of quantitative and qualitative measures, is the most rigorous form of evaluation. Now this might well involve the use of some controls, and I'd really like to know what your views are on whether RCTs are the gold standard of evaluation for behaviour change interventions. And I have to say, declaring a very ancient interest. I did a piece of work on research ethics committees many years ago now, and one of the issues around RCTs is, in order to design a perfect RCT, an awful lot of people get dropped out of the research. If you're looking at behaviour change for a population, an RCT might not be the best way of doing it, step wedge is one other, but there's various things that we need to kind of think about around here, so I'd really like to know about that. And then, the other thing was, is it ever possible to evaluate interventions where there have been lots of different measures introduced as a package? For example, in relation to smoking reduction over the last 20 years or so, nobody could tell us what was the effect of each of the different elements. So there's legislation, there's information, there's campaigns, there's nicotine replacement therapy, and so on. So which was the one that has the effect, or is it the combination that does it? And some witnesses suggested that establishing the relative effectiveness of different elements in the package can be done if controlled trials are used. But others said that it wouldn't be worth the delay in rolling out an intervention to test each element separately. So where do you draw the line between an evaluation which is rigorous and one which is so expensive that it can't possibly be a reasonable use of public funds? And the second thing is longitudinal. How do you get governments to commit to evaluating a measure for a sufficiently long time to measure the extent of the change achieved and the number of people for whom a change was only short-lived? And a reluctance to engage with longitudinal evaluation could jeopardise a lot of efforts to understand behaviour through applied research. But on the other hand, is it really reasonable to expect governments who are only in power, usually for rather a short period, to spend a huge amount of money committing to evaluation beyond their term? I do think that's quite a difficult one as well. And I'm going to shut up in a second. Fourth, what other organisations should government work with when they're trying to change behaviour? Now, the government told us that the involvement of private, voluntary, community and social enterprise organisations would be crucial for them as they sought to change behaviour. And much of the evidence that we received demonstrated that. It's absolutely clear. But witnesses also said we ought to be cautious about partnership working when there are conflicts between what the government's trying to do and what other organisations want to do. So businesses that want to sell more products like tobacco or alcohol or unhealthy food were particularly highlighted. The suggestion from some witnesses was that agreements between government and businesses who want to sell more of these unhealthy things were unlikely ever to be feasible. And that's partially relevant, and it was particularly important, in relation to our obesity case study. Can the government work successfully with the food industry so that healthy food choices become easier than unhealthy choices? Now we did, and I'm going to finish here, we did receive some very interesting evidence from Jonathan King, the Chief Executive of Sainsbury's, on this. He told us, and I thought this was wonderful, we're certainly going to use this, I'm not telling you anything else, we're certainly going to use this. He told us that voluntary agreements between the government and business were, and I quote, the refuge of scoundrels, tending to appeal to the lowest common denominator and often overtaken by political events. And he argued that Sainsbury's were not against legislation and would in some instances positively encourage it if it were easy for businesses to work with, which tells you more about the design of legislation and suggests that actually if the legislation, that if governments consulted with businesses about the design of the legislation, that might be a way of getting some behaviour change stuff through quite heavily, I think. Now, Sainsbury's didn't come up quite so much about reducing car use, but I would like to know what you feel about whether the government can and should work with other organisations to encourage more sustainable lifestyles. And the Green Deal was provided to us as one example of a successful partnership between government and other organisations because the roles were clearly defined and there was no conflict of interest. I'm going to stop here because I would like to take questions and hear from you, but let me just say one thing, which is I can't give you the answers, and I'm not actually sure that our report in the end is going to give all the answers I wish, but I don't think so. But this is an area, it seems to me, where it's absolutely critical that we do talk seriously about evidence-based policy making. It's just too easy to say, oh, people should do X, and governments say, we've told people to do X, and so that's all right then. It does seem to me we know quite a lot about behaviour change. There is a real gap between what we know and what we actually apply. Thanks very much.
Julia, thank you very much. There's enough material there for an entire conference, I think. Sadly, given the demands of the House of Lords, we've only got time, I think, for one round of questions. So we take 3, we'll make them good, and I think you've also got a standing invitation to get in touch about the inquiry too. There, in the middle. Gentleman there, thank you very much.
Yeah, the Leisure Press Association. Perhaps part of the problem academics have with government, or government departments certainly, is that the departments don't really always want to hear the message. I'm thinking of Adrian Williams' work on beef, which shows what an enormous carbon footprint it has, and definitely it's very hard to find anything in DEFRA that mentions that anymore. There's research showing that carbon will still be coming out of the tundra, and the Climate Change Committee don't seem very keen to know about that. And on carbon, I think carbon rationing got kicked into the long glass by a DEFRA report, and I think academics got a hard job, telling governments what ought to be told them, but the governments don't want to hear.
Thank you. Take two more. At the back there, gentleman with the blue shirt. Thank you.
Michael Smith from Quest for Future Solutions. 2 points. What about the identification of the obstacles to behaviour change? The one that strikes me as most useful would be the way in which planning authorities right now are looking at lots of applications for photovoltaics or other renewables, even against government incentives and government policy. How do we deal with that one? And that's been an ongoing challenge for a long, long period of time. And secondly, I'd like to just pick up on your point on design legislation. For example, many years ago I was involved taking the Department of Environment out to America to look at the contrast between their waste management policies and the design of the producer responsibility obligations in 1997. It was a disaster for Colorado. It's taken 15 years to get to a point comparable with California 15 years ago. Design legislation, I think, is critical.
Thank you very much. One more. Can you take us for one more? Please. Thank you.
You looked enthusiastic.
There's a lot to say. Hetty, I did really change. I wonder whether you looked at the work of Everett Rogers around adoption criteria and that building that in, the sort of 6 key pieces. One of the things, lovely stories, is people will not invest in insulation, for example, because you can't see it. And there's a lot of work that's been done around that, which I think could feed in very usefully to all of our work.
Thank you very much.
Shall I go?
Please.
I'm not sure, as I said, I don't think I can answer these questions. I'm not sure that Daisy can either, but let me say something about governments not wanting to hear the messages of academics. I'm only a quasi-academic, I'm not a real one. But I've been a bit of an academic at various stages in my life. I don't think governments really do want to listen to academics. They say they do, but they don't, because they know what they want to do. So I think there's something, and that's why I use the word devious advisedly. I think there's something about how academics have to be more devious in how they present the findings of their research. If you look at how the Roundtree Trust produces its findings, and it's got very detailed research, but the findings are quite short, they're very targeted at particular policy areas, and it seems to me that there's a bit missing, which isn't only about the translation of research, it's not about the technical things there, it's actually about how the message is delivered. I often think academics are not their own best friends in getting stuff onto the government agenda, and I often think that governments think they want to listen to academics, but actually they don't when they're inconvenient, and they very often are, and they should be. So I think there's something here about how you get the message framed in a way that will appeal to policy people, and also about how academics spend some time, I would argue. I think it really is important that quite a lot of academics spend a bit of time doing some policy work as well. Actually, I do think there should be more academics going into government briefly and coming out again. I think that the way we don't do what the Americans do so well, which is have people go in for a very short time and come out again. We've seen some of it, and some of it I think we saw some really impressive academics coming into government, trying to look at, say, evaluation, and actually making a huge difference. It tends to be quite short term, funded, say, by the ESRC, but you could do more of that, and it seems to me that there's a really strong, small p political aim there, I think, for academia as a whole, in encouraging the research councils to fund fellows who sit in government departments, showing how those particular techniques, say around evaluation, are used. That would be magnificent if every government department had somebody who was an specialists who knew how to evaluate policy interventions. I think some of the stuff we saw is stuff that we wouldn't have seen. So that's the first thing. And do governments want to listen? No, of course they don't, but there are ways of making governments listen. Secondly, obstacles. There are huge obstacles, and governments often are quite sort of, when I say two-faced, I don't mean they're deliberately being deceitful, they're just looking in different directions because they've got different constituencies they're trying to please all the time. So I think one of the things with obstacles is either trying to get around them. I do think there is something about people being very linear in the way they think, and I think academics are quite linear often in the way they think, and I think very often getting people to change their view in government is by going around the sun. You find a different way of getting to them. And you often make your point by getting in on a completely different issue. So I do think deviousness seems to be absolutely key in all of that. Okay. And the third point about, did we look at the Everett Rogers stuff? No, not particularly. But yeah, there's all sorts of stuff about, will individuals change behaviour if they can't see it? Will individuals change? I mean, I think we know a lot more about how individuals will change their behaviour than we do about how to change population behaviours. And I think an area that I know quite a lot about is changing people's behaviour in alcohol addiction and drug addiction. And I think, it's now pretty well attested that, what things work and what things don't work, and some of it, the jury's still out on some of it. I think we know more, and some of the things that, stop people doing the things that they think they ought to do are really bizarre, like, actually, they can't see it. Or, why do we all slow down because of drug addicts on the road? I mean, there are some quite bizarre features there, but we do know how it changes individual behaviours. A lot of research in that. I think the bit that's really missing is not how you change individuals, but how you actually get a population change. And I think that's the one where really, I think the really hard work needs to happen. And I think in sustainable living, we can change a lot of individuals. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of people doing carbon offsets and all of that. All of that will get more fashionable, etc. Unless it becomes a population-only thing. As indeed, the stuff around passive smoking, and people didn't like it at the beginning, but it's become population-only. I think it's very difficult. And I think that's the area where I would say to all of you, any more work you can do, gratefully receive, preferably in the next 4 weeks.
Very much. I've never been more reluctant to cut a session short, but given that the House of Lords is falling and the taxi is waiting...
Yeah, Daisy's got to count the votes and I've got to go and vote.
Daisy is glaring at me. That was an incredibly rich session. Thank you so much.